in this presentation sort of training session, I'm switching between the presentation and the software. So it's easier if I show it in this format. I know it's not the traditional format to show it, but it's just a bit easier to move around. So please excuse that. And just a quick overview of what we'll be covering. We're going to dive into the way that documents and properties can interact to give you much more flexibility in how things are presented. So just as a summary about the way documents work, when you're looking at the on-page content for a document that's been produced by Formpak, it's usually a combination of product identifying information, so your own code and name, your product code and name, and then particular values that are specific to that product. So it could be density, flashpoint, appearance, hazard information, any kind of information. And then document content. So this is the headings, the titles, subtitles, and standard statements. And then version information, so things like when the version was created, what version number it is, and when it was printed. And version information is typically on documents, but not typically on labels. But the other three things are on all documents and labels in the main. The area that is the focus are the two areas in the middle, so the product-specific values and properties and the document content, because in any given document, there's ways that they can be interacting, and how much interaction there are depends on the complexity of the document. So some documents are very complex, like safety data sheets and technical data sheets for flavors. And because of the number of variables that there could be, then the logic of the document needs to be able to cope with lots of different situations so that all of the variations can be handled. So examples of this are, for example, a flavor technical data sheet. You might want to show or hide subsections dependent on the product type. So for example, if it's something that needs microbiological testing because of the nature of that product, you might want to show the microbiological section. And if it doesn't, you might not want to show it, and you might want to say a different statement entirely just because it's not relevant to that product type. So dependent on the product type or what property values are available, you can show and hide different information. And when we dive in, we're going to see an example of showing or hiding information dependent on what property values are available. And where we're going to focus in today's session, just because it has the most applicability for the most people, is the safety data sheet. And we're going to particularly look at the CLP safety data sheet, although lots of the things we look at also are the same for other safety data sheets. So it's just using this one as an example. So the intent for people using Formpak is that as much automation is possible, but that you also need flexibility. So when ideally, you have all of your raw material information correct, and then when you add a formulation, you can press a couple of buttons and out pops a perfectly wonderful safety data sheet that's suitable for most people most of the time. And so what we're getting into in this session is for when it's not most people and not most of the time, but also those times when you want to add something extra to your safety data sheet because you have perhaps customer demand, or you're trying to demonstrate expertise to your customers, that kind of thing. So it's partly driven by customers and legislation and product that you might be wanting to have make use of the flexibility that exists in the document type. So on the CLP safety data sheet, what we have, we've recently completed the safety data sheet according to the new legislation, the 2020-878, which needs to be being used by the end of the year. It's currently being rolled out, but not very many people have it yet because it's just going through a period of testing before being rolled out more widely. But that is the one that we will use in today's session. And what accompanies that safety data sheet is some wonderful client notes, and I hope people have seen previous versions of this. And I'll just sort of like pop these on the screen for you. So when people get the update to the CLP safety data sheet within Formpak, they'll also get an update of the client guide, which explains how the most up-to-date one works. So obviously lots of things are the same, but then there's certain areas where it's different than before. And the way that I'm approaching this for the training point of view, is to look at certain areas of the client guide and then dive into them so that you can understand what the client guide is trying to tell you, but also see the opportunities that you have for doing that sort of like customization when you need to, because sometimes you need to. So the first place to start is actually this bit here. So for the unique formula identifier, the UFI. So for people who are in Europe or providing European safety data sheets, according to CLP, if you have a hazardous product, you have to notify it to a poison centre, and part of that is having a unique formula identifier, which is a unique reference that kind of matches the product that you're supplying with a number on the safety data sheet that's also then available in the central portal where you notify. Now, that you could have a situation where you have products and you only ever sell a product to a single customer, in which case that unique formula identifier, you may just want it to be added as a property of the product. So anytime you print a safety data sheet for that product, it looks at the property for the UFI of that product and prints it. However, you might be in a position where you sell the same product to multiple customers, and you can use the same UFI in that circumstance, but you might want to make each UFI specific to the customer you're selling it to. And if that's the case, you can have a UFI at cross-reference level. So if it's at cross-reference level, it means it can be different to the generic one that's at product level. And on the other hand, you might also want to just say, at the point I print my safety data sheet, I want to give the value of UFI. I'm not particularly going to store it. I just want to make sure it's available at that point. So the logic for it is that the ad hoc parameter UFI, so the one you type in at the point you're printing the safety data sheet, is the highest authority, because that's the most specific. And if you don't do that, then it will look for a UFI of the cross-reference if you've entered a cross-reference and if there's a value for it. And if it doesn't find that, then it will go on to the value of the property of the UFI. So property is least specific, cross-reference is more, and then the ad hoc parameter takes precedence as the highest authority. So just to show you what that looks like in the application, so if we pull this across, so I have a formulation that we can use for this, and if I go into print a document and add in this formulation, pick the CLP safety data sheet. Now, by not adding any company in, obviously there's no cross-reference, because cross-reference is the link between an item and the customer. So it's just a way of referring to it by customer. So if I just preview the safety data sheet, obviously it's prompting me, do you want to add an ad hoc parameter? I'm going to say, no, I don't want to, by pressing OK. And then the UFI that appears on the data sheet appears in the appropriate place, and it's it's obviously not a real UFI. It's starting with prop for property. Okay, so it's done the logic that we would expect. And if I now make it for a company that I know has got a cross-reference against it, so you can see it's popped up now. Okay, this is the cross-reference that relates to this fragrance for this company. If I print it again, it shows now the XREF, the cross-reference UFI. I'll just do one more. So if I instead put in the, I'm just going to type ad hoc UFI. See, now it's printing the ad hoc UFI. So exactly the logic that's described in the document is being displayed. And just to sort of like dig into each of those attributes and where they are. So if we look at this as a formula, and the UFI is in the CLP Hazards property group. If we scroll down, we can see it's here. So that was the property version of the UFI. And similarly on the cross-reference, if we look at the right customer, because obviously there's two with different cross-references, and this was the customer we were focused on. And we can see here is the cross-reference UFI. So again, just so that you know where the data is coming from and the priority of which data appears first, based on what's available. So the ad hoc parameter, if you enter it, the UFI of the cross-reference, if that's available, or the value of the property. Now, obviously, if there isn't any of those, nothing will be shown because it's not there. But also, if you notice here, it says, if the item has a value for it, of any of those things, then show the subtitle. So actually, if it's missing, nothing will appear. So if there's no UFI, you don't show a blank subsection of a safety data sheet because that's actually not permitted. You're not meant to show blank subsections. So that's the way that section works. Now, another area that's sort of commonly used by people is about product uses. So the relevant identified uses of the substances or mixture and uses advised against. And for product uses, so for a CLP safety data sheet, you do have to say for what uses a product is meant to, what uses are relevant for a product. You can optionally say which uses are advised against. So here, the logic is saying, okay, look at the property group recommended uses, and if there are no properties, show the value of the content, which is document content, which is this, the generic uses of the product. So if you're a company and you only supply a product for one type of use, so maybe you only ever supply fragrance products or you only ever supply flavor products, then you might want to say that your generic uses is fragrance, and then that way you don't have to put it in per item. You can just put it in once and it'll appear for everything. So again, this is sort of like reinforcing the hope that as much as possible is generated with the minimum effort, but that when you need flexibility and when you need to be able to change, you can. So just then coming back to what this means for the product we're looking at right now. So currently it's saying in that section 1.2, you can see here, product uses fragrance. So what we'd expect is a property in the property group recommended uses with a value of yes. So if we have a quick check of that. And there it is. So use fragrance, yes. Now another thing where, I mentioned that property groups and property information and document content can kind of interact. What we have at the moment on the safety data sheet is only product uses. Now, what we can do is we can say a use advised against, and that will then change. It will make document content appear as well as the value of the property. So we say maybe it's for use in fragrances but not flavors, for example, by putting a no. If we save that, and if we print it again, let's take that away. And now we have this extra row, uses advised against. So it's inserted some additional document content and given us the value of the properties that said no, which is in line with what it's saying here. So uses advised against, report the name of properties where the property is no, but if there are no properties, don't show the content. So, and that's because it's not compulsory to show the heading if none apply. There are some sections that even when there is no real data to show, it's mandatory to show the subsection, so that the whole document is sensitive to whether it's mandatory or not to show these things. And now on to another area. This is kind of more for explanation, really, because property types and property groups work in combination. They particularly have an impact in documents, and property types are kind of a bit invisible to most users most of the time. And property types are a way, they're kind of like, they can be a subsection of a property group, and it just gives you more flexibility in these kinds of scenarios, particularly with documents. So obviously with Formpak, again, the idea is you put in information once and use it many times. So from this area, the GHS hazard area, you put in GHS hazard information, and then it calculates what that means for GHS sort of purple book, but also for CLP, also for OSHA, and other regions dependent on what you have available. So the way this then interacts with a document is the parent is the GHS hazards. In this case, it's categories because we're talking about category, but the specific thing that's relevant for this document, because it's a CLP document, is the property group CLP hazards. So if we just have a quick look at that relationship in the system. So we're going to look at GHS hazards, sorry, GHS categories as a property type. So and you can see already here, when you're looking at property groups, there's only one GHS hazards property group, but for property types, there's more because they're all subsets of that GHS hazards. So if we look at GHS, I didn't mean to do GHS hazards, GHS categories, what we have is the top level categories. So things like aspiration hazard, obviously acute tox 1 through 5, for example. That's because 1 through 5 is relevant for GHS. However, if we then look at the CLP property group, so if we look at the CLP hazards property group, you can see we've got a lot more information in it. But if we then go down to the top level hazards, what we have are acute toxicity 1 through 4. So although the system is calculating 1 through 5, for CLP, the relevant ones are 1 through 4. So this is the way there's this differentiation between what's relevant per region. And in addition to the taking things away, you can also add things in. So that's, again, that's how the flexibility is achieved. And if we were looking at OSHA, then the OSHA would include the 5. So let's have a quick look at that. Again, just to scroll down. Oh, where is it? I'm saying it's 5. It must be at the end. It'll be at the end somewhere. And not always in the right order. So going back to this group here, what it's doing, it's saying if it's hazardous for CLP, show the name of the properties with value yes. And the reason this is useful is because names of properties can be translated. So if you just had text, you can't really translate text, but because these are property names, they can be translated, which obviously facilitates different language versions of the safety data sheet. And it's looking for properties that are in the property type GHS categories and the property group CLP hazards, and also sorted in the same order as that property group. And then to show the code and the name of each one that applies. Whereas with the OSHA ones, it would be saying GHS categories, so the same, but saying the property group OSHA GHS hazards. And the impact of that is this section here. So the name and the category here. So that's in 2.1. Now, Once a hazard endpoint is reached, obviously, depending on if it's relevant for the region, you have to declare it. So there's not wriggle room on there. Where you have some flexibility is in precaution statements. Actually, there was one thing I forgot to mention. Because this is legislation, so which ones apply in which jurisdiction, don't change it unless you really, really know what you're doing. And quite honestly, if you're changing it, or if you feel the need to change it, please speak to us first, because if you really think that something's wrong, then we need to investigate it, because all of the things that are coming out should be right. So there should be no reason to change it. And like I say, it's legislation, so it's meant to be there. Precautionary statements, you have a bit more wriggle room. So there are, in CLP, there are recommended precautionary statements relative to the hazards that are present, and obviously, and they do those based on individual hazards. So then when you have multiple hazards for a particular formulation, there's a judgment that has to be made. So if you've got one that is a higher priority statement, so it could be call a doctor if you feel unwell, or immediately call a poison centre. So having both of those statements on together would be confusing, and so the system is automatically trimming them so that that confusion isn't there, and so there's not redundancy as well. So it reduces them down, but looking into the rules or the recommendations, and there are a few that are mandatory, but very few. So the precautionary statements that the system calculates are automatically calculated based on the hazards, and you can, if you want to, remove or add precautions if you have a product where the system result is not what you need it to be. Be aware that if you make manual changes, particularly if you're removing a P statement, you do need to be careful, because obviously the hazards of that same product could change, and it's possible other P statements might be populated that make what you've done no longer the right thing. So, and you don't want competing advice on your safety data sheet. But I'll just show you an example that's a fairly realistic example. So going back to this formulation that we have here. So I'll just close that one down. So obviously we've said this is for use in fragrances. And if we look at the precaution statements, the first one that appears is avoid breathing vapor or dust. Now, obviously, the safety data sheet is a workplace document. It's meant for, professional users or industrial users. However, sometimes safety data sheets get issued to other types of users. They can even be used, issued for consumer products, and there's different things that are around that. But you might be concerned about saying on a fragrance, avoid breathing vapor or dust. From an industrial point of view, you shouldn't be obviously going around inhaling loads and loads and loads and loads of stuff just in your working environment. But if you're issuing this for a consumer product, you might feel a bit nervous about saying this, and you might want to switch it off. Now, the reason it's coming up is because it's a recommended precaution for this H statement may cause an allergic skin reaction. Obviously, skin allergy is different to any kind of allergy by inhalation. You don't get they're two different mechanisms entirely for a skin reaction versus a respiratory reaction. But in any case, this is still a recommended phrase, and so it appears in Formpak as standard. If the only products you do mean that you never want this, then rather than switching it off individually, you could have a custom version of the property that creates it in order that this never appears. But typically people aren't asking for that. They're just needing to know sometimes that they can turn it off. So to turn this one off, I will show you how to do that. So, and obviously we're only going to do this for this individual formulation. So if I go and modify it again, what we can see is CLP hazards, which is where all of our stuff for the safety data sheet is or predominantly coming from. And so if we go here, we can see we've got this avoid breathing vapor or dust. If I untick it, because that's the is calculated box. So we're going to say, okay, it was calculated. We don't want it to be anymore. And I'm going to change this to no. And I can save it. As I save it, it'll recalculate and remove that precaution from the overall thing. Now, what I'd like to show you on here is it's saying to show the code and name where the if the property has got yes or SDS or yes small label. Now, so we've just made it no, so it shouldn't show it because we've made it no. But just to highlight that the reason for this differentiation is a small label has very, very little space, and typically it will just say one statement like refer to the safety information before you use it. A label can contain, much more precautions, and a safety data sheet can contain all of the recommended precautions, so you've got even more room on here. So this is that differentiation between small label and safety data sheet, so you are getting some nuances in that. If we go back to print again, scroll down to those precautions, you can see now it's gone. So it was there and it's gone. If I just show you the other one. So there it was, avoid breathing vapor or dust. And now because we've said it's a no, it no longer appears. So obviously that's just us switching off for this individual product, not for all products, just this one. And then we also have sometimes situations where, dependent on the nature of your product or the audience that your product is, or the safety data sheet audience that your product has, you might want to show some additional information. So an example might be strong odor, take care when handling. So it's not really a hazard as such, but it could, if it's a strong odor and there's a leak, it could be a bit alarming, and so it's a way of alerting people. And actually there can sometimes be an implication for transport by air where things that are very strong in odor might not be permitted. So it could also be used as a bit of a flag to say, is it or isn't it allowed to be shipped in by that method? So with lots of sections in the safety data sheet, you can use the property groups or property types to either add individual properties per product, or even if there's something that you always want to show, put a property that might be calculated into a property group in order that it shows. So this is the 2.3 other hazards section. So just as a, I've obviously closed it now. Let me show you that. So at the moment in 2.3, other hazards says none. So we've not done anything special here. But what we're going to do is flag that something's got a strong odor and take care when handling, even though that's not quite the case. And we're going to do that at the product level. But if there's something that you want to add always or often, you might be able to use a calculated property. So I'm also going to show you an example of pushing an existing property into this property group, CLP other hazards, in order that it appears. So this is something that you're adding for information, not particularly a hazard, but it contributes or is the driver for the hazard of the aspiration hazard. So let's do both of those things. So for one thing, we want to modify the formulation again. And we're targeting the CLP other hazards property group. And if we're not sure what's in there, we can do show all properties. This one's only got this one, and then we can say, okay, we want this to be a yes. Oh, we can save it. And what we can also do is we can modify a property group. So if we do the same property group, so CLP, it's not CLP other hazards, we can add in that property that already exists. You see it's a calculated property. We can save it. We can change the order as well. So we have this move to button. So if you're wanting the order is typically the order of the property group. And so if you wanted these to be the other way around, you can change it by doing move to, but I'll just save it. Now, if we have another look at this, obviously we didn't modify it, but if we go back to that property group of other hazards, now that hydrocarbon percentage is also shown in that property group. And what we would expect if everything does as it's told. Is now we have these other hazards. So instead of saying none, it's saying strong odour, take care when handling. And it's the hydrocarbon concentration percent, which is the name of the property, with its percentage. So it makes it super flexible. You can give obviously all of the mandatory content, modify the content that's open to your professional view, as well as then adding in additional content that is not in that mandatory area. So now if we look at first aid measures, so first aid measures, and just so you know, I'm not going to go through every single section in this level of detail because I've come to a point where the different types of manipulation that are possible have kind of been covered, and so we will jump over a few sections in a short while. So the description of first aid measures, again, the idea, because we're trying to make people's life easy, is you press a calculate button and the right things happen, and it shows the first aid measures that are relevant for your product. So it's looking at the hazards of the product that generate the precautions of the product, and then so here it's saying, okay, looking at the precautions and the property group CLP hazards, so that's the same area it was looking in before, apart from it's now looking at just precautions. Looking at those that start with P304, then push them into this place. So it's making the precautions or the first aid measures specific to the product because it's relating to the hazards and the precautions of the product. And if there aren't any properties that meet that criteria, show the generic statement. This remove from exposure site to fresh air, keep at rest, and obtain medical attention. So that is the standard behaviour that everybody gets. Now, what you can do as well is straight underneath the subheading, you can show the name of properties with value yes in the first aid general property type and property group first aid measures. So let's have a look at the kind of properties that might be, because obviously at any given point you might be because the areas that we're showing you are very user configurable. So there's not a whole lot of Formpak data that's given, because the whole point is we don't know everything about everybody's products and everybody's use. So the things that we can predict are typically there, and these areas are a little bit outside that. So if you wanted to find out, okay, what properties might be in that property type first aid general and property group first aid measures, you can actually use search for property. So in search for property, you can do an and search. So we're going to say property type first aid general and property. So we're going to change it to and property group first aid measures. And if we then search, obviously we haven't got a huge amount, but we've got, call on-site first aider for assistance. That sounds quite useful. We've got this other one that's just like a test one. But what we can do is say, okay, we want this to be the first thing that people see when they're looking at those first aid measures. So to make that happen, we've got to go into the first aid property group of our item. And if we say yes to this, and again, the reason these are yes, no's, because it's very easy to then know that they're either switched on or switched off. And again, it really facilitates translation. We have translations that are either directly from the legislation or from professional translators for the typical regulatory content, so the content that's driven by the legislation, the H and the Ps, the subheadings of safety data sheets. So we have that, and we maintain that for people who need them. When it comes to values like this, we don't put translations in because some of them are just our suggestion as an example of the kind of thing that you can do, and it's everybody would have a potentially different idea about what they want to say. So just kind of be aware of that, and we'll come on to that in a minute. So we can save that. And now if we go back and print again, on that first aid section, it says call on-site first aider for assistance because we've just made it happen. Now, obviously, this 4.1 section was was kind of changed in the last round of changes to make it clear that you did have to put a first aid based on exposure route. So what if you had a specific first aid measure per route? So there's actually logic in the document that allows you to also do this. So I'm saying, and it is all there in the notes. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly do another quick experiment to show you how to modify that. So if we again modify it, and these are in the first aid area again. And if we do show all properties, you can see that you've got eye avoid, skin avoid, ingest avoid. That sounds like a Dalek, doesn't it? Ingest avoid. Do not consume this product. Now, I know this is going to be obviously based on what it's telling you. You can kind of guess which section this is going to appear in. If we come back, you can see how many times I've been modifying this up to version 26. And preview. So we can see on the ingestion, do not consume this product. So it's a way of overriding what would automatically appear. So that by product, if you have things that can't be calculated from the hazards, and that the standard statements aren't appropriate, you can make additional statements and insert them into the different sections. I'll just close some of these older ones down. Okay, so if we now go back to the this section. So in the 4.2, have we covered that? I'm wondering if I'm just jumping ahead. Am I in? Oh, okay, so no. So yeah, so 4.2. This is saying show the name of the properties of the item with the value yes in the property group first aid measures and in property type first aid important effects. So this is an area where we probably want to look again at the property type. So let's have a look at first aid important effects. So here we've got this suspected of causing cancer by inhalation. This obviously is an H statement, but maybe you need to say this is because this is such an important effect, you want to make sure it's also put in the first aid section. Now, anything that you put in here as a property, and then you flag it to say that it's there, will appear. So we'll just use this SDS test as a quick example. Sorry, it was forgotten which property group it was in now. If I go back to so first aid important effects. So no, first aid measures. In the right. So Show all properties. Okay, so if you notice, this one is calculated, so that's why it doesn't automatically appear, because it only will appear if there is a value for it. So what we can do is change this to yes, and then we will expect it to appear in that other section. There we go. So it's a way of inserting an additional statement where the most important symptoms and effects are the hazards, the health hazards, obviously not the environmental hazards, but the health hazards of the product. And if you wanted to say something else, so maybe if you were supplying a product that was frozen, you might want to talk about the skin burns through coldness. And in addition to inserting that manually, you could have a relationship between, for example, another property. So if this is a product you always sell and you supply it frozen, you could either have it in a property, an item class, or have a property that says this is frozen, and the this is frozen attribute causes this to always be calculated and appear here. So you can do them manually, you can make them calculated if it's possible to calculate them. So that's kind of like a bit of a choice. Now, obviously, you can see now we've jumped from 4 to 9. Section 9 is an area that has changed in the latest safety data sheet legislation. There's not a huge change from a reader point of view, but from a Formpak point of view, it was quite a bit of change. There's lots of sections that moved around, and there was additional things to add. Now, as you know, the section 9 area is quite large. There's lots of physical properties, physical values that you can include. So for our example, we don't have a huge amount of data. What we can do, though, is add some more. Now, the way the safety data sheet legislation is phrased is if you don't give a value for something, there's an expectation that you kind of explain why, and typically people don't explain why, and most of the time that's completely fine, but occasionally there's an enthusiastic inspector that says, well, why aren't you saying why it's not there? So I'm just going to kind of have a look at a few of the ways around that. So in absence of information, most of the areas will say not determined. There is this one here where it's saying not relevant, but typically it's saying not determined. So what it's doing is in each of these areas, it's saying for things that are really, really common, it allows you to have some generic content. So for appearance, if everything was always a clear oily liquid, or if everything was always per the specification or something like that, then you can add in some document content and then it will show. Otherwise, it can show the values of 3 properties pushed together, sort of concatenated. So the clarity, color, and state. The reason for this is because these can be choice properties, which allows you to do translations. Or, and this is the most common at the moment, used by most people, is there is just an appearance that is given, and then it's just text. So if we have a quick look at those different scenarios. So if we look at the formulation again. So we've got appearance currently with no value. Let's change that to clear yellow liquid and save. And if we print that, so too quick, there it goes, clear yellow liquid. And if I quickly modify it again and I use the other properties, so I can instead use, if I do appear clarity, I can pick, so okay, it's clear, and appear color, I can pick again, and obviously you can add translations in for these. Formpak again, don't do them because they're customer specific. And there we go. So now you can see that obviously this was not capitalized, these are capitalized, just to sort of like draw your attention. Okay, so now we have that capitalized because it's pushing the three together. Okay. And there's another area in section 9 that I kind of want to show you before I kind of do a little bit with some translation things, which is one of the things in the legislation is about if you don't have data explaining why, but the other thing is if you've got data for one of the ingredients and not the whole formulation, you are allowed to do that as well. So I just kind of dig into that a little bit so that you can see. And people typically aren't adding raw material data as to represent anything to do with the formulation, but it's kind of handy if you know how to do it, just in case. So again, we'll do a modify this formulation. Now, what there is one of the areas is kinematic viscosity. And I don't think anybody's too concerned about it in our industry. It's probably relevant if you wanted to demonstrate that aspiration hazard wasn't relevant because it was very viscous. But outside of that, probably not so relevant. So if we say kinematic viscosity, now we don't have it for the whole of the formulation, but I did look it up for limonene, which is one of the components that's there at a reasonable level, and it's between 0.9 and 1.1 millimeters squared per second. And obviously that's not for the whole formulation. I'm adding it against the formulation to force it to come out on the safety data sheet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a note about it. So the note about the kinematic viscosity, and I'm going to say that the data point relates to an individual ingredient of the mixture. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to put a note about the whole thing. So just popping back to the to here, we can add we can add a SDS9 note, which will then kind of appear in a generic way for the whole of that section. So if and this is fully in the notes, even though it's not all on the presentation. So SDS section 9 note is added as choices for the so that you can translate it. Okay, so we could be saying test results apply to the tested mixture, if that's indeed the case, or maybe test results are not available because the product is a complex mixture or something else. So we could be saying where it says not relevant, it's because it's not relevant, and where it says not known, it's because of some other reason. So we can say whatever we like. So I'm just going to select that there and save. we print again, we now have that kinematic viscosity with a value saying it relates to individual ingredient of the mixture. And also then at the end, test results are not available because product is a complex mixture. So it's just a way of doing those tweaks to the safety data sheet when you have to because of the circumstances, or when you want to because you're giving information, additional information to customers to help them. We have also got this other section, this other information. This text is inserted via a property type group, so it's the same deal. It's, if we go back, it's another example where you can add specific information or the default. And if we go back to the client guide and we go down to that section, because obviously, this, you can see this is 30 pages long, so it is quite a long guide, but believe me, if you're trying to manipulate a section, you're very grateful for it. So if we go down to that section 9, so it's report the names of any properties with yes in the property group other physical SDS properties, and if there are none that are relevant, then show none available. So it could be if you had raw materials, you might want to show molecular weight, because obviously that's not one of the physical parameters that you need to show in the list that's mandated, but it could be molecular weight for chemicals could be useful, or any other information that you think that your customers would either routinely ask for or would find useful. So you might be storing that information in the physical data property group just for information. By adding it also into other physical SDS properties, it will also come out in section 9.2. So again, it's just another way of manipulating things. We've kind of covered most of the examples of the way you can manipulate data. They're either like this or very related to this. So hopefully you'll be able to sort of like find your way around it. And although this is a CLP safety data sheet, the logic is very similar in other safety data sheets. Not always the same, but it is similar. And so this is just like to highlight one more, and this is quite typical. It's in persistence and degradability. You can report the names of any properties with value yes in the property group eco persistence. Now, one thing to highlight is because these are the twiddly bits, it's possible that on your system you might not have the property group eco persistence, but if you add it and then put properties into it, it will still work. So you don't have to have us add these property groups. If you're making changes to existing property groups, beware, but if you're adding a new property group in order to kind of get some of this behavior in, you're pretty safe.
And just to note that they are case sensitive.
Yes.
So copy carefully from the client guide.
Thanks, Dave. And then just the area that is different is section 15. And the reason it's different is because it's for other regulatory information, and that the breadth of that can be whatever any company wants it to be. And so therefore it's less predictable. In the other sections, we've got a better idea of predicting. I wouldn't say perfect because I don't think that really exists, but better. In this section, it's really hard for us to imagine all of the different things that a company might either want to do or be pushed to do by the client base. So the logic here, and again, it's expanded in the client guide, is to report the names of any properties with a yes value in additional regulatory information. So that's similar to what we've seen before. And then for other properties which don't have a blank value, showing the name of the property followed by the value. Again, we've seen that before. And then for properties with an entry list, this is the new bit. For properties with an entry list, to leave a blank row, then show the name of the property and then show the entry list as a table. So in section 3, this is what we already have. So basically in section 3, we have the this is an entry list in a table. What the Section 15 behaviour is allowing you to do is to create your own entry lists, and it will not show as much information as this, but it will show the name, the CAS number, and the percentage. So if you needed to call out a particular subset of raw materials, you could do that in additional regulatory information. And if you wanted to show them minus the concentration, you can actually, there's a different property group that you can use, and then it shows the name and the CAS, just not the name and the CAS and the percent. So it's a super flexible section, actually really handy in the OSHA safety data sheet, where there is often more that needs to be said, but can be used in the CLP safety data sheet too. So what we haven't covered is the translation implications, although we've sort of like talked about them quite a few times throughout. So I'll just cover those for a few minutes, and then we'll probably be ready to take questions. So what we have done is, obviously we have our safety data sheet in English with lots of different sections that we've then modified. So things like these sections we've modified. Now I think I might have left the translation in for this, but let's have a look. So anything that's outside of the normal, in terms of it's not a hazard or precaution statement, it's not a proper subheading, you know, it's those kind of contents that you've chosen to put into a safety data sheet, may not have a translation. So if it's very standard content, it might, but it might not. And so the way to see what translations exist when you have done that is to obviously print it in that language. So if we do it in French, and then preview it, we can sort of like do a where's the dodgy English appearing. So here, this text is inserted via property group type. So that's obviously English. So there's something that's there that would ideally be French. If we scroll down, obviously these are both translated. I actually translated this in this morning session and forgot to translate it back, or to remove it, but we'll have a look at that in a minute. And then as we go down, if we look into here, we've got ingestion, do not consume this product. So that's a special one, obviously, that we added that is in English, and so that translation isn't present yet, which is why it's coming through not in French. And the same with these others, this text is inserted via. And so as we go down, the standard stuff is translated. There's other things that are not necessarily translated for the reasons that we have mentioned. But you can see this one here, we do have a translation for that one and not for that one. So if you're adding in these extras, just kind of be aware of that so that you know how to address it. And where you are addressing it is in the translation. So I don't know. So we maintain translations for the content, you know, the hardcore content that I've already mentioned. If you need to add further translation content for those kind of phrases, or because you actually want to translate maybe even a different document that we don't maintain, enter translations is where you do it. If you've got a huge pile of translations, we can import them for you. But if you're just doing odd bits and pieces, you're as well to use the tool that's here. So you might remember from the beginning that it's either document content or property, typically, that you need to target if you're trying to enter translations. So the things we've done have all been properties. So I'm going to go property, and I'm going to look at the French. And the code that we looked at that I forgot to change back was about the hydrocarbon. So the reference content was hydrocarbon, or contained the word hydrocarbon. And you don't have to put all of the content, but if you see any English in a foreign language safety data sheet, you can just search for the content that's in English to then find out, okay, you don't have to know its code, you can just search for the content. And you can see, so this is the content that I added this morning to say, okay, the French translation of this is this. And what I've also done is said prevent batch update, yes. So, and normally it says no, and I'll show you a bit more about that. So one of the areas that we had that wasn't translated was the "do not consume this product." And I'm going to be a bit naughty and just use Google Translate to translate that in a second, but I'm going to take that away. And if I put "consume" as part of my English content and search again, you say "do not consume this product has no French language translation." So, and just so you know, so Formpak always use the legislation content in foreign languages or the professional translation service. So we don't go into Google and supply translations to you. But for the purposes of this, I'm just going to grab that. And I can't quite see my translation screen anymore. Just pop behind something. Oh, there it is. Okay, so if I paste that in, what I'm going to do, I'm going to say prevent batch update, yes. This means for the translations that Formpak manages, periodically we issue updates so that it either, so because sometimes the precaution phrases change and therefore the translations change. Sometimes document headings for the safety data sheet change and so the translation changes. So if there are things that you are adding and you do not want us to update them, if we were maintaining them, then if you put prevent batch update, yes, we will not overwrite any of your translations with any of our translations. So that's the way that you do that. And so it says I've updated it successfully. And if I go back to print the document, just going to find my fragrance reference again. I do it in French. We now have ingestion in French because we added the translation content. So if you do have a any English in your foreign language safety data sheets, that's the way to tackle it. Or if you think it's something that we should be translating, obviously come back to us, and it could be that you haven't been updated for a while or something like that. So do ask us if you think it's something that we should be managing. Okay, so that's the end of the sort of formal part of the presentation and training.